Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everybody. I'm Preacher Moss, host of the SOS Shout Out Show. Hope that you're having a fabulous Wednesday. We're glad to be back on the air. Peace and blessings to everybody who was on last week. I had a pretty good topic on last week. This show is a bit somber. If anybody has been watching the news, it has not been a good week for humanity, equality, justice, life in general. We on the Shout Out Show, and I speak for the team here. Uh, while we understand oppression, while we understand a lot of aspects of dealing with not having justice a long time, it never really burrs over the fact that we affect innocent lives, civilians, if you will. And this is on the case of both the Hamas and Israel. I'm going to probably do something separate from the shout out show because I think people really need to understand, what this very, very dangerous game is. That people have put themselves in a position where, for lack of a better word, we are watching folks structure the lives of folks for the next 30, 40, 50 years. I think that in my space, in my space, I believe that understanding the Israeli Palestinian thing has been fuzzy. It's been really been fuzzy, largely to the fact that as a Muslim, a young Muslim, back in the day and watching this, I just watched people who were just very, very uh, lacking in discernment about things that were important. So I kind of have to look at that as well. And fortunately, that's not our topic today. Our topic today is Islamic finance, and we're really, really blessed. And work with me. I have to bring our brother in. We're really, really blessed to have this brother on. Um, he's one of the few people, one of the few people who can actually talk about Islamic finance. He worked with a couple of CDCs, community development corporations, and his knowledge is very extensive. But I think that what he has to say today, and this is on the eve of we're going to have the first North American Islamic Finance conference here in Houston. That this is a guy who is African American who has studied, he has interned, and what I love is that his information that he's willing to give it to us. So I would suggest that we pay attention. There are going to be some questions that, of course, he wants to ask. I want to ask him. And if you have any, because I think the thing about this is if you're not looking at it the correct way, you're thinking Islamic finance is just for Muslims. It is not. I guarantee it is not. A lot of the money that goes into finance, Islamic finance, is not Muslim money. And, we can argue and debate about that because when it comes to finance or financial instruments, if you will, people want to make money. It doesn't matter if you're black, white, Jewish, Muslim, people want to make money. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break. Satan, I apologize. We're going to take a quick break, commercial, and we're going to bring him in because he's having some problems. Coming in, we're going to make sure we bring our brothers in. Don't move. This is Preacher Moss on the Shout Out Show. Yeah, so, my first, I guess, introduction to convenient urgent care, they were providing masks and supplies for people who didn't have supplies during COVID. And I went to pick them up and was going to take them around to some of the local areas. And I ran into a brother named Ijaz Saeed. And as I began to talk to Ijaz, it was very, very clear that this brother had a vision for community service. Oftentimes, when you have urgent cares in a situation that they're not necessarily doing a prevention or education, he came up with the term a home of the smart patient. And I understand what that means. It means that people really want to be in tune about their health, but at the same time, they also want to be in tune about the people who are providing health. This is a very organic relationship. And little did I know, a year or so later, I would actually have to call on their services when I was in dealing with some physical trauma, if you will. And I have to say, they held my hand and they took me through the process. The offerings of telehealth, the offerings of being able to walk in consistent. I was in pretty bad shape, but they treated me like I was the president of the United States, not that one, Obama. Okay, I'm joking. But what I want to say is the professionalism, the dedication, the care, compassion, and the consistency, all the things I just named, makes convenient urgent care the space you want to go to. 3 locations in the Houston area: Cypress, Pasadena, and Parker Road in Houston. But I want to say the overall conceptual understanding of convenient urgent care is that they care for their patients, even when the patients don't know how to care for themselves. Check them out. All right, so I believe that we have my brother locked in. He'll be coming. He'll join us in a couple minutes. Before we start, let's bring Sister Satana on. Sister Satana, we haven't seen you in a minute. Can you pop in? She don't want to pop in. Pop in, Sister Satana. Come on now. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Your mute button is on. There you go.
101.
There you go. It's been a minute. If you want to hear something, you got to touch that mute button.
Yes.
Make sure that it's not working against you.
Exactly. So welcome, shout out show family. It's good to be back. Good to have you here. Excited about our guests and timely information that is needed. So excited.
A couple of years ago, I had a guy who was telling me about Islamic finance. Now, what he was looking for was some money. He was telling me about all the different levels of, grades or series of investment that you can make. Guy was out of he was out of Toronto, and it looked impressive, But then the skeptic is like, "How long you gonna hold my money?" And when I get in that conversation, I'm like, I don't know. And it's interesting because it's been such a hot topic, but it's not flourished like I thought it would. We're talking about maybe 10 years ago, 11 years ago, we were talking about this guy. He gave me the whole breakdown, the name of the bank, the whole now, and it's like I can't find that bank now. So I think that's an interesting piece. But I'm glad we have Brother Faheem Hamed on today to talk about Islamic finance because I've always been interested, but it's I don't say it's a slippery slope in some regards, but it does concern me. It's like, how are we repurposing our money? Is it for the community? Is it for straight finance, commercial banks? I mean, a bank is a bank in principle. But we have a conference that's coming up right now. I'll get you guys the flyer. We have a conference that's coming up in Houston, Texas, October 20th and 21st. And I am telling everybody to make sure that you get to this conference. There are other things going around in Houston. I'm saying take an hour or two. Go find out what some of these scholars and some of these experts are talking about. Some of it. Yeah, I think the thing is, we have to make sure that, we're in the proper state of mind. I look at finance and currency and things like that, and it's like, there's a lot to this. Like there's a very deep profundity to this thing. Like if you don't understand money, literally, if you don't understand money, man, I mean, it's gonna be a problem. All right, but Sister Tana, thank you for jumping on. We have our brother on.
So I put the registration link at the bottom.
Yes, we appreciate it.
So good to see everyone.
And thank you so much, and continue to do that good work, dear sister. So, Islamic finance. I've always been introduced or intrigued about the idea of finance. That particularly African Americans have not been, in many regards, well schooled in the context of how money works and how money works for you, but more so how money works for other people. That understanding finance creates a power block that's probably more bold, more formidable than a lot of things that we're talking. I think understanding money is probably bigger than voting in some regards. And so we're going to bring our brother on, and we're going to talk to him, and we're going to have a conversation. That's what we like to do. We're going to have a conversation, but we're trying to get some information because at this point in time, the U.S. economy is fluttering. Housing is da-da-da. But the one thing that matters that you have to know is that people still spending money. People still using money to spend money. All right, my dear brother. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We say talking Islamic finance. Finally.
Wow.
My dear brother, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. How you doing, beloved?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Trying to get to here. Is that better?
That's better. That's better.
Appreciate you having me on your shoulder, brother.
Oh,
it's always a blessing to share time with your brother, and wanted to share some exciting. I think we still have a little.
I think we have a little device that might be open. You don't have your phone open, do you, beloved?
I don't think so. Bear with me.
Okay, no problem. While we're doing that, let me got some love in the building. We call it a shout out show family. Just want to give a shout out. Sister Rhea, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hope you're doing well. You, Derek, Dewan. Shout out, of course, to Sister Satana. Wa alaikum assalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My main man, Altaf Rashid, better known as Mr. 6 o'clock, straight up, straight down. He is our ambassador to the show, the shout out show, coming all the way from Canada. And we have Sister Salahuddin Dalton representing Brother Bilal. How you doing, beloved? Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And Brother Eric Carter coming all the way from South Kakalaki. Wa alaikum assalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So, brother, we talking Islamic finance finally. We done talked around finance in our community for a lot of years. We talked about shea butter. We done talked about CDC. We done talked about suits. We done talked about CDC, suits. We done talked about meat. We done talked about... But let's talk about money. What is, to the layperson, your understanding of Islamic finance?
Assalamu alaikum. I do, brother. Let's see. So what Islamic finance is well, perhaps we can start with about this coming out. And it's a Islamic conference. That's going to be happening in Houston, Texas, October the 21st. And the first conferences around the world, very few in the United States. It's sponsored by College, and the Graduate Islamic Finance Program. The name of the conference is National North American Conference on Islamic Finance, and it's basically going to be an international forum of scholars and practitioners from around the world to speak on the topic of the industry today, what's going on, as well as what's the prospects of expanding Islamic finance in the United States. The conference itself will be a 2-day. You can participate either in person or by Zoom. It's going to be about 20 different presentations on a range of topics. Some of the speakers are renowned in the industry, but a few of those would include Dr. Hassan, Dr. Khan from Malaysia. There'll be an attorney, Dr. McGee, who's going to speak on the issues of tax, which are really crucial to the issues of Islamic finance today. And then a presentation by one of our host partners called AOFI, which is Accounting and Auditing Standards for Organizations, Islamic finance organizations. And basically, this is the entity that does all of the certifications for Sharia compliance around the globe. So it's a pretty big deal. They're excited about our participation because, as I said, this doesn't happen a whole lot in the United States. I've actually been to a few of these conferences abroad, but coming here to the United States, I think, is just one more indication of where this industry is headed, the projected growth in this country. And we're pretty excited about it. Registration, we'll give that information before we go. There's a small fee. We hope that it's the first of, that it's an annual conference and it's the first of many to come. So we're pretty excited about it. I am participating on the organizing committee. And my role really evolved out of my graduating this past December in their graduate program, a master's in Islamic finance. And throughout my tenure there, I was one of a few people who continue to raise the question of, yeah, but what about the United States? And what about dealing with communities of color? And what about dealing with persons with middle incomes and lower incomes? What kind of strategies, models, tools, directives exist to address those populations? And that was in response generally to the industry, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, that right now, Preach has a lot of products, a lot of services for high net worth income individuals, and that's fine. That's actually, it's across the globe. There are a lot of those products available, but not so much for people of lower incomes, middle incomes, and then on top of that, when you look at the fact that the United States, which of course has the largest economy in the world, really only has about less than 1% of the Islamic finance industry. So bringing that conference to the U.S. today and bringing it with some of the participant partners that I've identified and some others is really significant, because we hope that it represents the start, kind of a new effort to see the industry grow and specifically see how it grows relative to the issues that are peculiar to the United States. And there are several, which we'll talk about shortly.
Ask a question. Before you got into Islamic finance, what was your background?
Background before that was, I did about 30 years basically in community development. That was the work that I did. I had education in journalism and urban planning and in law, and then most recently in Islamic finance. But my work in community development entailed working with credit unions, business incubators, worked in the Bay Area in California for a number of years. I actually started one of the first incubators to exist in the state. Work with small business development and business financing, and always with an eye towards how could those resources be applied to improving our communities. And so having done that for about 30 plus years, I will note that I'm a member, converted to Islam as a member of the Imam Muhammad's community, and have been doing that ever since.
Back a little bit. This is such a big piece that you're talking about. Why is it not really reached out to people of color, lower income? What is the allergy that's out there that doesn't allow us to take a part of this?
No, and that's absolutely a fair question. And to be clear, one that I've raised on several occasions myself with my colleagues and my instructors. And the answers, Preach, are multiple, right? It's a multitude of answers having to do with historically recent history of our relative inability to organize capital in a way that benefits our communities. And I just flashed in my head, and we often use the analogies and we see the examples of immigrants coming to the United States, literally in our own neighborhoods or adjacent to our neighborhoods. And within short periods of time, they're able to organize their capital, their resources, such that they can acquire real estate, businesses, investments, banks even. And we've been here for many, many years and can't do it. I think that, in broad terms, it has a lot to do with our relationships with money and capital. I think that in large terms, it has to do with, not having histories of understanding the value of how to use capital to build communities. I will note that I thought it critically important as I began to look at this issue and study it. Some of the basic concepts that, that we've always talked about, and I recall Imam Muhammad used to talk about years ago this notion of four birds, and one of those being economics. And what he said is that these are the represent the tools that we need to have in place if we're going to build successful community life. And so for me, it was always a matter of trying to translate our collective ability as people, our collective pennies, if you will, and figure out a way to combine those cooperatively in a way that we can build upon that and leverage that. I think those are the tools that certainly in history past among African-American folks and other communities of color, was particularly African-American folks, we understood. We lost that a little bit. I see that coming back around, but I'll layer that with this aspect, Preach, because this is what occurs to me when I look at Islamic finance. In as much as we understand the need to have capital and to leverage that and to build communities with that, we also have an additional consideration, and that's the issue surrounding making sure as much as possible that what we do and how we do what we do is Sharia compliant. You know, this is far for us. This is not optional, and I think that means that we have an obligation to do as much as to adhere to that, or to do as much as we can towards making sure that we're moving in that direction. I think we have to work, we have to examine and look at building or reconciling those systems that are not up to standards with Sharia compliance. And, you know, as Allah has commanded us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us, and then do what we can to build around that. Now, having said all of that, I fully acknowledge that this whole campaign is relatively new for us. To be very clear, Islamic finance as an industry is new in and of itself. It really is only, I guess it was the early 70s that the modern Islamic finance began to evolve, not coincidentally after the discovery of oil in the Middle East. And so it's been X number of years since the development of that, and with some fair amount of development in MENA, that's Middle East and North African countries and other places, Southeast Asia. Not so much in the United States. And the talk is that the United States represents sort of the last frontier. And so if we're going to go at it, we got to go at it. My job and my view is that we should make sure peoples of color and people of lower and middle incomes also have access to those resources as Islam has prescribed.
Let me throw this out. This is probably maybe it relates, maybe it doesn't. You know, we're dealing with the whole thing of Gaza. We're dealing with Hamas. We're dealing with Israel. And, you know, you do your homework. You say, why is it these people are in this space that are... And you realize, man, for all these years, Palestinians don't have a currency. They don't have a currency. It's either the shekel, the US dollar, or the Jordanian dollar, which are astronomically hard to get and earn. You know what I mean?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I thought in some regard, I said maybe Islamic finance, if used correctly, allows us to build community that invests back in community. I'm like, I think that is probably the big upside for what we're talking about.
Well, I think with respect to the Middle East and particularly with Palestine, we first need to understand it's probably not an accident that they don't have a currency. They also, for a lot of time, don't have water and electricity. And those certainly are keys to building community life. It's certainly a valid question, and you have to ask, given that Islamic finance, you know, is it sits right there in the Middle East. And the assumption would be that, well, you have all these Middle Eastern countries and governments right here with their own Islamic financing resources. Why isn't there more in a place like Gaza? I don't know as much. I can't speak as much directly to what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine, but I will tell you this. You know, when you examine the growth of Islamic finance in the world, interestingly enough, some of the most aggressive growth has actually not been in the Middle East. It's actually been in Malaysia and a few other places. Middle Eastern countries come in right after that. And then, not surprisingly, some of the biggest growth that's occurred in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, is certainly among the West, has been in London. You see, they have many of the largest Islamic financing houses in the world are right there in London. So Malaysia has really been pretty strong about this, and not only in terms of actual dollars and volumes and investments, assets under management, but also in terms of their, how do you say it, their willingness and their push to create facilities and products that make the Islamic community work, if I could use that. And I put the cliches around that because that becomes the source of a lot of debate among Islamic scholars around what is and what isn't Sharia compliant, what is permissible. And there's a whole science to that. It's not just a matter of do this, do this. I will note that the history of Islamic finance, the evidence supporting the history of that can even be dated back to the days of our dear Prophet ﷺ, and certainly sources in the Quran as well. But the practicality, and particularly as it relates to modern financing, is something that's an evolving technology. And so in as much as there's short things that are not happening in the Middle East, the industry is growing very, very fast, particularly with the development of new projects. And I might add, even with the advent of what people are referring to as fintech. It's creating in a faster way, in a more efficient way, a lot of opportunities to do banking, to do other kinds of investment services that didn't exist before.
Okay. Let me ask you this. A couple of years back, of course, everybody was talking about cryptocurrency. Myself, I was really hyped about the whole idea of being able to develop coins and things like that. It's particularly for the artists that we could legislate our art. Is there space for that in Islamic finance?
Well, it's certainly a space for debate, and there's plenty of that happening. There's plenty of that happening, and it's a legitimate conversation for sure. I think at the core of that debate preaches the issue with respect to cryptocurrency. Is the issue that goes to one of the primary elements of what constitutes valid Sharia compliant Islamic finance. And there are several, and actually this is a good opportunity to segue into that, but that is this. One of the principles in Islamic finance is this notion that in any trade relation exchanges, that the assets, that the deal has to be backed by real assets that have measurable quantities that can equate to the value on the contract, and that they not be overly inflated. Okay. And so that principle alone has a lot to do with how and why people were taken aback a little bit by the currency growth. It's not that it's not a valid commodity, but the real question, and I think we can see evidence of how that's played out in the courts literally yesterday, is where's the backing? Contrast that, if you will, to the United States. And this is not advocating for or against cryptocurrency, but contrast that, if you will, to the United States and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which has by law, asset backing of all the depositors, all deposits up to a certain amount, up to $250,000 per deposit. That's the kind of asset backing that Islam holds as important to any trade relationships. And I'll note also that when we had the financial crash in 2009, many of those financial houses went under, and Islamic financial institutions were least impacted. Why? Because their assets were backed by their commodities were backed by assets that had real value, and so they took less of a hit. So that's one of the issues dealing with cryptocurrencies, other kinds of investments. I will say that Islam, a lot of people, well, the question is, well, what is Islamic finance? Is it socialist income? No, Islam is basically premised on free enterprise. And I describe it like this: it's free enterprise with limitations. Okay, it's not free enterprise, but it's free enterprise with limitations. The principles, and if I can go through it just for a minute, when people talk about Islamic finance, the first thing that pops up is what you can't do. But one of my sheikhs was very astute in talking about, let's talk about what Islamic finance allows you to do, because what Islamic finance does as a set of principles that you use to build and guide communities is pretty instructive, and it's actually pretty supportive of growth and fairness. And some of those include, for example, the notion of business and trade. And as I said, I talked about that as free enterprise with limitations. The principle of risk sharing. That is this notion of partnerships with equity investments. Quran talks about sharika, and that has to do with partnerships. Thirdly is this notion of risk and return. They go together. The idea is that you can take a certain amount of risk, but that should be tied to a projection of return. And that's what constitutes, a valid risk equation in Islamic finance. I talked about trade exchanges being backed by real assets. There are other notions of like justice, fairness, and balance, in the information and trade. The concept of mutual cooperation solidarity, which is extracted from Quran, Surah Al-Ma'idah, talks about the concepts of mutual cooperation and trade. That's a principle in Islamic finance. And then this notion of income inclusion, which is derived, preach, if you will, from the ideas of not only investments, but the utilization of zakat and debt forgiveness. And we, for sure, think about zakat primarily in the form of helping the needy, and that's, certainly one of the considerations. But the Quran on its face speaks to at least 8 categories of how zakat should be used. And it's noted that even in some other countries, zakat is a valid source of public sector funding that's used to leverage businesses. It's used as investment capital for small businesses. It's used to help people get out of the debt. That's a legitimate Islamically directed use of zakat.
Let me throw this out here, because I love what you're talking about. Is there space for something to be like an Islamic stock exchange?
My dear brother, there is already an Islamic stock exchange. Alhamdulillah, I can't cite the name for you, but there have been practitioners been working for maybe the last 12 years, working with current, stock exchange authorities, and I'll follow up with you to get the exact name of that. And there are indexes, there are indexes on the stock exchange specifically for Islamic products and what have you that already exist. And what those do, by the way, is they profile the products, and what they do is they take out the considerations that are not Sharia compliant. That is the use of all the things like alcohol, pornography, pork, gambling products. In many cases, that also includes investments or different kinds of securities that's dealing with weapons of war. And then they list those on stock exchange. They list those in as investment options, and those are included on the stock exchange. And it's a subsidiary, if you will, of current stock exchange markets. So I can certainly follow up with the news about where that is, but that's there. Now, I'll note that a lot of high net worth individuals understand this, utilize this. The question and the challenge for us in America today is, how do you bring these resources, this information, these tools down to the level of middle income, lower income folk, people of color, so that we all have a sense of understanding that those options are there for our use.
I just feel like, we when it comes to banks and investments and things like that, it's like when they come to our communities, there's just such a heavy debt narrative. It's like, you owe me this money. You're going to give it to me. I'm not going to give you anything back. And you're going to like it. And you're going to give me more money. And I think, I think moving forward, shout out, Sister Janet. I think moving forward, man, I talked about demystifying this thing. How in the world are we going to be able to educate folks on this thing? There's a deep reorientation that needs to happen here in the United States.
Absolutely.
And we don't teach finance in school. We don't teach finance in school. We don't teach Islamic finance in Islamic schools. So we're not producing a think tank or a quorum, if you will, of people who can talk about, something other than the fundraiser. We got to raise. Fundraising that's not finance. That's fundraising.
Well, the chicken dinner, right? That's that, and you're absolutely right. And I will say humbly, I mean, that's the reason for me. That's the reason I'm excited about watching this industry evolve into the United States. Alhamdulillah, I will say I actually attended my first Islamic finance conference. I believe it was 1997, because it occurred to me very on, particularly in the community that we were in. I've always been this kind of person that's I understand religiously what we need to do, but I also understand very pragmatically that we have to do for self. And we've all heard that before. The question for me was always, how do you do that? It's fine as a rhetoric, as a form of rhetoric. I mean, the Imam Muhammad Muhammad, and may Allah may rest in peace. He spoke to us again about the four rivers, and he talked about what the formula was. The question, and I think the challenge for us, is how do you do that? How do you take that principle and then translate that to institutions, to programs, to bodies of knowledge and information that then itself can translate to building your communities up? And to be very clear and to be very fair, that's not a one-off kind of process. It's really about building institutions. And so as long as it takes to build institutions is as long as you do that. And the reality is that once you start to build institutions, you realize that it always requires patchwork. You always have to tweak it, update it, keep it going. I am confident and hopeful that we're on the precipice of starting that conversation and starting that work in the United States. I will tell you personally, and I've been in conversation with a few folks are starting to, and the interesting thing about it is that there's some folk around who have some expertise and some capacity with it. What I found, not surprisingly, is that everyone's sense is kind of like, yeah, it's just not enough folk talking about it. And I'm only able to commit so much of my individual time and energy to a conversation that only two people are going to have. The reality, as I said, and so I'm excited, honestly, dear brother, that I see that changing. I see some of the growth around that. Couple of things that I'm hopeful for example, is I'm looking at Abe just being a part of the conversation going forward, talking about what this means, what it should mean for us as a community, what it should mean for us in terms of Muslims, in terms of the obligations that we have in this deen. And then what does it mean for options for us to grow and expand? I will note that I'm extremely excited by what I see in terms of, what the kids are talking about. I say kids, meaning the younger generations. And Muslim and non-Muslim, a lot of the products that they see out there, it's very consistent with the values that we talk about and identify in Islamic finance. I mean, they talk about things like wanting to make sure that the activities they're involved in are SRI compliant, the ESG compliant. They want stuff that's socially responsible. They want to make sure that projects and entities are, environmentally, socially, and their governance are compliant with certain standards, and that they don't have certain kinds of investments. Now, those are not new concepts in the United States. They've been around for some while, but we've watched their evolution. And it was a delight for me to see and understand that those values, they parallel exactly the principles that we understand and know in Islam as a set of principles. Now, and to be very clear, we don't always see folk following that, but that is the stretch, and that's the thinking that I'm hearing among younger folks today. Now,
let me throw this out.
Go ahead.
I love it. And we've had great ideas and we've had groundbreaking concepts in this community. But too often these ideas get killed in committee of the Muslim community. I had a dream that Islamic finance was going to be championed by China, and we're all going to be sitting on the sideline looking at the Chinese make money off of Islamic principles, Islamic dawah, Islamic art, and Islamic finance. Can we get together, if you will, the feasibility? We have different communities, immigrant community, indigenous community. We have so many. Can we get to a point where people go, wait a minute, stop the presses. This is something that we really need to be on.
I live to be a pragmatist. I operate out of our pragmatism. And so I'm not unaware of the sentiment that you expressed, brother. But at the same time, I actually can tell you, I've seen movement in this direction, and I've seen movement in this direction for our communities. I think that and if I can be specific for a moment, if we're talking about the African-American Muslim community, I think we have to necessarily take some steps take a minute and assess our situation different from other communities. And I said it for some of the obvious reasons, right? You look at some of the immigrant communities, and we've all been to these events where they sit up and, and alhamdulillah, they're able to raise, $1 million in an evening, right? And that's wonderful. That's wonderful, alhamdulillah. But we don't have that capacity, so we have to start from where we are. We have to start from the capacity that we do have. I think part of that, as I noted earlier, has to do with understanding as a matter of principles what our goals should be about. Some of that we've been taught for years. We might have forgot a little bit of it when, lessons like do for self, lessons about the rivers. Those are not brand new concepts for us. In fact, I can recall years past when we actually had capital. We had capital. I think our question, and the reality is, I think our question about our history is not whether we could produce capital, is how we managed it and how we invest it. I'm hoping and praying we can do a better job at that going forward. I will tell you some of the things that I see that might be helpful specifically for African-American communities. And then I'll expand this to other communities, other income communities, because I'm hearing also similar kind of concerns, for example, being raised by immigrant communities from North Africa, for example. And some really interesting work is happening in some of those communities that is something to make note of. But when you get down to like what's the to-do list? How do we get this thing done? I think that we have to just deal with some basic concepts like how do you build partnerships? How do you look at equity investments? How do you take the notion of cooperative economics and translate that into real kind of earnings and community building? Things like, for example, Canada, some immigrant brothers in Canada for years have had a very successful cooperative housing piece up there. And that's just what it is. It's cooperative housing. And I'm not advocating that over anything else, but it is a model of how Islamic finance can be successfully applied. I think we have to seriously re-engage this conversation around how we use WAFs, endowments, to protect the institutions that we build and the managers and the people who manage them, right? I think we need to look at impact investment funds. I think that what we need to, an approach that we can take, dear brother, is we can, in as much as we're doing for self, I think we need to also figure out ways to approach other people with smart investment opportunities that at least projects a respectable return both for them and ourselves, that will help us leverage ourselves into different categories of funding so we can then continue leveraging into other activities. There's lots of money around. I know that's not new. It's how do we leverage ourselves into it? How do we partake in current investment opportunities that can give us the kind of return? And let me add one thing. And this, I was just reminded of something that I think is worth repeating. During the life of Imam Muhammad, may Allah forgive him and bless him, I had 3 conversations with him about these ideas, in-person conversations. And in one of the conversations, I recall him saying to me very emphatically, he said, listen, dear brother, he said, listen, I like and agree with just about everything you're saying. He said, but our biggest problem as a community, our biggest challenge as a community is trust. And for sure, he knows his community, and that's what I've seen over the years. One of the things that Islamic finance will allow us to do, I think, is figure out some ways to, as I say, and as I've written about, we govern ourselves by our ethics, we manage ourselves by our contracts. So we have trust issues, but we got to tie those down with contracts and collateral. And there are ways to do that if we're willing to negotiate those relationships between ourselves first, and then with third parties secondly. I think, for example, the idea of looking at pooling funds, the idea of looking at microsource lending resources is an excellent way to do it. Let me say that. Not excellent way to do it. It's the way that other communities have been doing it for years, right? Other small communities have been doing it just like this. This is not rocket science. It's just reinvented for us, right? I think that the idea of entrepreneurship training, management and accounting systems that incorporate Sharia compliant considerations is process we have to bring to the table, along with, and I'll add this, along with those values that I talked about beforehand. Because as I've thought about this during my academic process, the questions that you asked is a question I ask myself at least once a day, dear brothers. How do we get out of this? How do we get out of this quagmire? How do we leverage ourselves out of this? And then the question is, well, how do other folks do it? Well, it's like Imam Muhammad said, it's like common sense tells us. It doesn't start with the dollar, brother. It starts with the relationships. It starts with the relationships of trust. It starts with having a set of principles that you as a community agreed to abide by, and then you allow those to move you and move your dollars to the areas that you need them to be moved to. I know that doesn't build the building, but I think that is the process.
I think the thing is, man, I really like the idea that, not like the idea, I'm really, really open to the idea that we do have relationship deficits when it comes to money. That the money more so decides the plan, that people are not really looking at, they're not being pragmatic about money. They're not understanding that to invest money, you put in $1, you're not going to get back $2 tomorrow.
That's right.
It requires a certain discipline, and it requires a business ethic. You've got to see the money work. You've got to work along with it. And I think sometimes maybe that's the thing, because we have to get out of the thing where we're just selling stuff on Friday after the match shit.
Well,
and I don't get Friday. I love the stuff on Friday. But we've been doing that for so many years. There's only so much oil, so much ginger juice we're gonna sell, lemon cake. It's only, and I'm like, well, where's the business? Where's the business model that expands this? I see it some places in some of the communities. So for it to be real, it has to be a lot more comprehensive.
Yeah, and this is being repetition. I really do think it gets back to those fundamental principles, because as I said, we've seen, and I've even studied some of these communities in terms of their Islamic applications of how they build their communities. And so it's not rocket science. It's just a matter of deciding that we're going to do some things cooperatively, as you alluded to, that we're going to contend ourselves with the long-term return, that we're not looking for it today, then that we're going to make some sacrifices to build this community. And I humbly submit that we once upon a time, I felt like we were in that mode. Not so much these days, but that is the formula. It actually is not magic, and it's not far off. That is the formula. That's what everybody does to build their communities.
Well, I mean, to me, you know what I'm saying? The push, sometimes the impatience is that, man, we're running out of time. And we do have this conference that's going to be coming to Houston. What are your expectations of the conference? What are you trying to achieve in this 2-day conference?
So I will note that there are a lot of different people at this conference, and there are at least 20 different topics that are going to be addressed. It's going to be fairly informative in terms of what's happening with the industry abroad, as well as what prospectively can happen with the industry domestically, right? And that's part of what happens when you have, this kind of internationally based forum. This conference in particular, as I said, I'm looking at to leverage out of that some relationships that will allow us to have, if you will, some sub conversations in terms of what could be done at quote unquote more local levels around helping certain Islam Muslim communities of color move forward. And let me also say Muslim communities that also what I would describe as middle income, because as I noted earlier, a large part of the current portfolio of Islamic finance products, deals with high net worth individuals. They're not struggling to be Sharia compliant in their day-to-day lives, but it's how does the smaller guy, the smaller family do that? And one of the things I'm looking to do is push for and pull out information and relationships that will help move that part of the conversation. It's the first of its kind. The prayers that it's the first of many. So we're optimistic and hopeful that we can push this agenda, dear brother.
Brother, it's been wow. It's been a lot of information. I know we've been talking about this for a couple of years. I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us. I've been blessed to see you make this transition. You know, my big brother was with the CDC, and he was this, and he was going to school, and you know, just to have somebody in that space that could really speak to the I want to say speak to the tenets of Islamic finance, not in just the scope of this is the Sharia compliance stuff. Please talk about, you know, what are the business opportunities that go along with it. You know, for so long, you know, Sharia compliant meant that no riba, no interest, and we've been stuck on that thing for years.
Right.
Looking at people who are developing stuff, and yeah, I think there's just a big upside that we're not seeing, and I'm hoping that with your conference and continue work and due diligence in our community, that it'll continue to grow.
Inshallah.
And we'll love to have you back on the show to keep it growing.
Well, inshallah, I would love to do that because, as I said, we're just touching the tip of the information in terms of the tip of the iceberg in terms of information, particularly as it relates to applications in the U.S. Alhamdulillah, I am on the organizing committee of this conference, and as a matter of fact, I'm one of the speakers. So I'm excited to my commitment is just to push this agenda. So inshallah, we'll get a chance to push it more, and as I said, hopefully more and more folk will get involved with this from a developmental standpoint, and we can come up with some things that make sense for our communities and ourselves. Inshallah.
All right, dear brother. Anything you'd like to add before we go? I always say give us a 1 minute pitch about why we should come to the conference.
The conference in and of itself, as I said, it's a first in the sense that it begins. I think it represents a real milestone in beginning the dialogue of what Islamic finance could look like in the United States. There are a lot of different people with different perspectives there, different products, different interests that they want to do. I'd like to make sure that we take advantage of all those resources to see what can be done to help advantage our own communities and move our communities forward. The conference is an opportunity to get those relationships lined up, get the information in play, and then just be a part of moving that agenda, inshallah. Inshallah.
Well, we're gonna close out, man. You know what? Why don't you close us out? Close us out with dua.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Almighty God, Allah, we pray your mercy, we pray your guidance. We ask you to keep us. We ask you to grow us in this industry, grow us in our knowledge, grow us in our work. Have mercy on us and direct us. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wal asr inna lisana la fiqus inna alladhina amanu wa amilu solihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr.
Appreciate you, bro. Shout out again to all the suffering, not just in Gaza, but around the world.
Yes, sir.
Those who deal with oppression on a daily basis in their lives and their spirits, we pray that Allah lift you up, increase you, and give you a firm understanding of His grace and mercy when other people cannot.
Yes, sir.
Dear brother, we appreciate you, man. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good luck at your conference, man.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.